The Rainbow Tower. Written by Alex Tymms. Illustrated by R H Stewart. Episode 1. Violet. Here they come. You know what to do. Jed gave Trevor one of those "do you think I'm an idiot" looks. Trevor pretended to ignore it and raised the battered binoculars to his eyes again, perching his normal glasses where his thinning hair met his creased forehead. Like everything else the recycling team used, both sets of glasses were cobbled together. Made from cast-off bits and pieces, they didn't look much, but they still worked. Twirling the warped button on the binoculars, Trevor zoomed in on a group of scruffy people picking their way across the rubbish heaps towards them. "Why?" he sighed. Trevor had spent the last few weeks ensuring his own team had met all their targets for sorting the plastics, paper, card and metal which came from above. Other team leaders weren't so diligent and resorted to other ways to make up any shortfall, especially the night before an inspection. The big man counted to himself under his wheezy breath as the group crept forward. "OK, they're at the first marker. Time for you to go," he breathed. "And I know, Jed hissed back. "Don't be seen or heard." Jed moved swiftly out from behind the pile of sorted cardboard that he and Trevor hid behind, even though Trevor wasn't exactly small. He nipped between other large piles, this time of sorted porcelain and metals, and ran silently across their cleanly swept home area. Through the gloom, he could just make out the tall shadow of the steel support that was his first goal. Around him, the rest of his team pretended to be asleep. All the people on the recycling floor slept where they worked, and come downshift, they would simply unravel their bedrolls. However, not all of them kept their home area as neat and tidy as this one. That's because they didn't have Mrs. F on their team. Jed glanced towards her. She looked like a fragile old lady, but Jed knew there was a core of steel inside Mrs. F. It was also clear she wasn't remotely asleep. He could see her keeping her piercingly blue eyes on the young twins next to her, while her wiry hands checked the knots in the rag rope running near her bed. As he passed, she glanced up at his hair and frowned. Jed had asked old George to put it in dreadlocks not long ago, and it was clear Mrs. F didn't approve. Beyond her, old George himself wasn't snoring loudly enough to be asleep, and Jed could see that beneath George's light blanket he was clutching the lever for the counterweight release. Jed grinned as old George let out another fake snore. At the far end of the home area, Jed tried hard not to stare at Eva as he crossed behind her. She was a few years older than him, and while Jed was as thin and wiry as the copper cables they had to recycle, Eva was all curves. She caught him looking at her and hissed for him to keep his eyes on his work. Jed looked away, feeling himself going red despite his best efforts not to, and cursed inwardly. Once again, she'd made him feel like a little kid rather than the teenager he actually was. Then he passed Simon. Simon, who stared at him malevolently. Simon, who'd made it clear that he thought he should be on this mission, not Jed. The trouble was, despite being older than Jed, Simon had proved time and again that he couldn't do anything quietly, and the last time he'd tried to climb a stanchion, he'd become stuck halfway up and the whole team had lost an hour's work trying to rescue him. The more they came to know him, the more they realised why he'd been demoted from Indigo. Jed smiled innocently back at him, only for Simon's scowl to deepen, which was exactly the effect Jed had wanted. 2 paces later, Jed reached the limit of their home area. Beyond was where the rest of the tower dumped its rubbish from huge ceiling chutes into conical piles for Jed and teams like his to recycle. Silent progress from here was going to be tricky. If he put a foot wrong, Jed would start a material slide loud enough to wake half the floor. Keeping low, he picked his way carefully over the rubbish, heading for the huge steel column he'd identified earlier. It was just one of many holding the chutes and other parts of the superstructure above their heads. Jed risked a glance over his shoulder. He couldn't see the rival team, which meant they couldn't see him. He reached the foot of the stanchion and peered up. Far above, in the violet glow of the company's screen telling them all to strive for indigo, he could see his next target. It was one of the coal black mouths of the recycling chutes. Jed inspected the steel column. All the beams on the recycling floor were the same bare metal, meaning once Jed had learned how to climb one, he could climb them all. They were made up of two flanges joined together by a single central section. Trevor called them I-beams after his old-fashioned way of writing a capital I. Jed gripped the flange of the I-shaped beam in front of him and began to climb. He knew he had to be quick, for even though he was in shadow, his movements could still give him away. The climb was hard work, but at least Jed knew how to do it. He and Trevor had worked on this floor together for as long as Jed could remember, and for most of that time Trevor had been the brains and Jed the brawn. Jed had been able to reach places that Trevor hadn't a hope of reaching, and he smiled to himself as he pictured his overweight and unfit mentor attempting this climb. Jed shot a glance back to his home area as he neared the top. From way up where he was, it really did look like they were all asleep. He just hoped the raiders thought the same. A crunching sound from somewhere just below made Jed duck into the metal latticework of the roof and stop. The rival team were right under him. Jed held his breath as his heart sped up and his blood thumped in his ears. He hadn't expected them to reach the second marker already. He'd have to hurry if Trevor's plan was going to work. Jed fought down the urge to move and waited, still holding his breath. Had they seen him? Was Trevor's plan ruined? There was no alarm call or shout, so he allowed himself to breathe. He waited another second or two, which felt far too long to him, then began to weave between the pipes and girders crisscrossing in front. The pipes grumbled and groaned around him as they carried waste to other areas for recycling or processing. Waste deliveries continued all the time, even if it was downshift. Squeezing past a large waste pipe, Jed almost gagged. Foul-smelling liquor seeped from one of the pipe flanges and was now smeared down the front of his overalls. He didn't remember any of these pipes ever carrying anything that smelt so bad. Trying to ignore the stink, he pressed on. At last, he reached his objective. Using his sleeve, he wiped the side of the chute to make sure. Just visible under the smeared grime was the number 13. Jed put his hand on the huge metal casing to find it vibrated slightly. This was the one, all right. He grabbed the heavy chains just beside the chute, trying not to make any noise, and heaved. Very slowly, the black mouth began to swing round. Jed grimaced as the chain chafed his hands, but at last he managed to swing the opening through 90 degrees. He leaned over the edge and looked down to the floor far below to check the chute was in the right place, when something made him stop and stare. Walking across the chaotic and filthy home area of their attackers was someone in a suit. Even from that height, Jed could make out the pinstripe pattern on the bulky coverall with the tie motif of a manager on the front. Add to this the square glass visor on their hood and the clipboard they carried, and Jed knew for certain this person was from HR. It was very odd to see them alone, for HR only ever worked in teams. Jed frowned. This didn't feel right. As the suit moved off, Jed realised something else. The rivals' team area was surrounded by piles of sorted cardboard, tidied glass, porcelain, and clean metal. Well, the piles weren't as neatly arranged as his team's, but as far as he could tell, they were big enough. Jed was confused. Trevor was convinced the rivals were trying to steal stuff to meet their quota for the inspection. But from where Jed was standing, he could see this wasn't true. The rivals had plenty of recycled waste. In fact, it looked like they had too much. So why were they launching a raid? This, coupled with the presence of an HR manager, convinced Jed something was very wrong. He hurriedly secured Chute 13 by wrenching the chain into its lock, giving up on any attempt to be quiet, then threw himself at the assault course that led back the way he'd come. He clambered, bumped, and knocked his way towards his home. Stealth didn't matter anymore. This was urgent. He had to tell Trevor. As he ran, from far below, a shout. The raiding team had launched their assault. He shoved his way past the stinking waste pipe and saw far below his team leap to their feet. Old George rushed across the home area, clutching his metal bar. Jed knew he didn't have much time. He pushed on, so busy watching Eva and George secure the lever in the winch that he knocked his head on a roof beam. Cursing, he tried to ignore the pain and ran. He saw the iron bar rammed home. George and Eva grabbed it in both hands and hauled on it for all they were worth. Jed launched himself at a rag rope in the shadows just as it jolted into life. He gripped it hard as suddenly he plummeted down, his feet landing on the huge weight George and Eva had just released. He'd made it. Below him, the rival team charged forward with ugly shouts, their wild hair flying. Thank you very much for listening to The Rainbow Tower. To see more of R H Stewart's excellent artwork, you'll find him on Instagram at roy.hootson.stewart. For Alex Tymms, why not try the novel OutCaste at ao3.com? Or, for something completely different, check out the Amier series on YouTube or at amier.com, also by Alex Tymms. The Rainbow Tower. Text copyright Alex Tymms. Illustrations copyright R H Stewart. The right of Alex Tymms and R H Stewart to be identified as the author and illustrator of this work has been asserted in accordance with the Copyright Designs and Patents Act 1988.